Have you ever walked through a city and felt the layers of time beneath your feet? Sydney, glittering by its famous harbour, is not merely a place of postcard beaches and steel-sculpted skylines. Here, ancient rock carvings overlook office towers. Centuries-old gum trees stand sentinel as ferries churn across the water. Through convicts and colonists, gold rushes and global wars, booms and heartbreaks, Sydney has always remade itself, sometimes painfully, sometimes brilliantly on the world stage. So, let's journey together, peeling back the city's layers, to see how a landscape, first known as Warren, became the dynamic metropolis we call Sydney. The land was, and remains, alive with meaning, a living library of stories that explain the origins of every tree, rock, and animal. Law, lore, and land were inseparable. To care for country was to care for oneself and one's ancestors. Aboriginal people actively managed their environment. Through firestick farming, deliberately setting small controlled burns, they renewed grasslands, encouraged new growth, and shaped the landscape to suit their needs. This practice, misunderstood for generations, is now recognized as a form of ecological engineering, keeping bushland healthy and supporting diverse animal populations. On January 26, 1788, the first fleet sailed into Port Jackson, forever transforming the world of Sydney's first peoples. To understand the city today, we must first honor its Aboriginal roots, a living foundation. Older than the city itself, that continues to shape Sydney's identity and spirit. But even as this seismic event approached, the Awara's legacy remained etched in every tide and tree, a testament to the endurance of the world's oldest continuous culture. Their scientific knowledge, refined over countless generations, included precise calendars, star lore, bush medicine, and complex navigation by landmarks in the stars. Sacred sites still scatter the region, some hidden in city parks, others preserved in national parks like Ku-ring-gai Chase. Rock engravings, some thousands of years old, can still be found on headlands overlooking the harbour, depicting fish, whales, kangaroos, and mysterious spirit figures. This is the city's story told in full, from its Aboriginal roots to its rise as an urban wonder. Trade routes crisscrossed what would one day be Sydney, connecting coastal people with those of the inland. Stone, ochre, food, and stories were exchanged along these paths, fostering an economy that was sustainable, sophisticated, and tuned to the cycles of the land. But in 1770, a new chapter began, one that would forever alter the course of Sydney's story. Captain James Cook, sailing up the east coast in the Endeavour, charted Botany Bay and marked it as a place of advantage. His brief encounter with local people was marked by misunderstanding and caution, but it set in motion a tide of change that would sweep across the land. It's a palimpsest, a living document, overwritten with the dreams, losses, ambitions, and triumphs of countless generations. For over 60,000 years, Aboriginal Australians shaped this region known traditionally as Warren, leaving their wisdom inscribed in the rocks, rivers, and rhythms of the earth. They were not a single tribe, but a web of clans, each tied intimately to distinct tracts of land and water. Among these clans were the Gadigal, the Camaragal, the Wangal, the Burrabiagal, and others, each with their own languages, customs, and sacred responsibilities. The harbour was their supermarket, their playground, their dreaming place. They fished its teeming waters, harvested oysters from its rocky bays, and navigated its complex coves in bark canoes. But to speak of subsistence alone misses the full picture. Their relationship with the land was not just practical, but spiritual, encoded in a complex web of stories, songs, and ceremonies. Every headland, every brick, every whispering eucalyptus tells a story far older than British sails on the horizon, older even than the city's first streets. Sydney's saga begins, not in 1788, but in a world shaped for millennia by the first Australians, whose intricate kinships with this land forged a legacy that still echoes today. This is a story of transformation, of survival and sorrow, of wild ambition and relentless adaptation. Long before the clamor of ships in the harbour, before the word Sydney existed, the land that now gleams beneath the Opera House and Harbour Bridge was alive with a profound human story. The Awara Nation, whose name means simply the people, called these shores home. The dreaming, or Dreamtime, formed the backbone of Aboriginal culture, a vast, interconnected cosmology mapping how ancestral beings created every element of the landscape. Socially, the Awara and their neighbors organized life through kinship systems that governed not just family, but marriage, responsibilities, and trade. But this deep-rooted way of life was not static or insular. By the late 18th century, the Awara had forged a world perfectly attuned to their needs and beliefs, a world neither untouched nor wild, but shaped by careful stewardship and deep understanding. The years that followed brought sporadic contact. Whalers, sealers, and explorers skirted the coast, but for the Awara, the horizon was about to darken. This is where Sydney's story truly begins. Not with European flags, but with millennia of wisdom, belonging, and deep connection. The arrival of Europeans on the shores of what would become Sydney was not a sudden invasion, but rather a gradual, uneasy dance, a period of curiosity, misunderstanding, and ultimately upheaval. Captain James Cook, the vessel's resolute commander, stepped ashore with his crew and made brief contact with the local Gweagal clan, part of the larger Darawal-speaking peoples. The British misunderstood the intricate Aboriginal land management and saw Australia as terra nullius, nobody's land. In fact, the continent was crisscrossed by complex boundaries, territories, and alliances. The error would have consequences that rippled for centuries. Their encounter was fraught. Cook's men, determined to claim land for the British crown, fired muskets over the heads of the Gweagal after a tense standoff. The Awara still held ceremonies, fished, and told stories under the southern stars, their world seemingly eternal. Yet, on the horizon, a fleet of white sails approached, a fleet that would mark the most profound rupture in the region's history. A day later immortalized as Australia Day was for the newcomers an act of empire and survival. For the Aboriginal custodians who watched from the bush, it was the beginning of an invasion that would upend their world. Few at the time could comprehend the magnitude of the change. Benalong, taken as a guest, and later escaping, it became a bridge between worlds, living with both the British and his own people. And famously traveling to England with Philip in 1792, the landscape changed rapidly. Trees felled, tents erected, gardens planted, land cleared for crops and livestock. The stage was set for Sydney's next chapter, the convicts and the building of a colonial outpost. For the British, survival was a daily struggle. For the Awara, survival meant navigating the twin challenges of dispossession and disease. The age of encounter had begun not with a single battle, but with a series of complex, often heartbreaking interactions that would define the character of the city for generations to come. Barangaroo, a powerful Cammergale woman, fiercely resisted British encroachment, defending her people's traditions and challenging authority. Yet even in this moment, neither side could fathom the full weight of what was to come. Philip, disappointed by poor soil, lack of fresh water, and a hostile coastline, quickly realized that Cook's promising reports had overlooked the area's difficulties. After a tense encounter with two French ships under La, an episode that nearly turned the course of history, the British explored further north. The British, desperate and anxious, faced an alien environment, unfamiliar animals, harsh climate, and poor provisions. With them came new disease, smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis, against which the Aboriginal people had no immunity. In just a few years, epidemics swept through the region, killing an estimated half of the local population. The trauma was incalculable, with entire clans decimated and knowledge lost in a single generation. They watched with fascination and sometimes envy as the Awara harvested fish, moved gracefully through the bush, and thrived where the newcomers struggled. Philip himself sought to foster peaceful relations. He issued strict orders against harming Aboriginal people and attempted to open dialogue, even going so far as to have two men, Benalling and Colby, captured in an effort to learn about local customs. There, in the deep, sheltered waters of Port Jackson, Philip found what he described as the finest harbor in the world. The first fleeting contact between Aboriginal custodians and European mariners set the tone for a relationship marked by wonder, caution, and tragically catastrophe. In April 1770, the HMS Endeavour anchored in Botany Bay. Cook's journals, now famous, record his sense of discovery in a land inhabited for tens of thousands of years. The decision was strategic and practical. The bay, mapped by Cook, was seen as suitable for ships and settlement. The following year, under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip, the first fleet was assembled 11 ships bearing over 1,400 souls, including Marines, officers, sailors, and more than 700 convicts. For nearly 2 decades after Cook's visit, Sydney's future remained uncertain. European ships sometimes skirted the coast, but for the Eora and their neighbors, life continued much as it always had. Meanwhile, in faraway London, the wheels of empire began to turn. In the wake of the American Revolution, Britain's prisons were overflowing. With the loss of the American colonies, the British government sought new lands for convict transportation, a solution to both urban overcrowding and imperial expansion. In 1786, the British announced their intent to establish a penal colony at Botany Bay. As the first fleet sailed, Aboriginal life around Sydney Harbour continued, seemingly undisturbed. On the 18th of January 1788, the first fleet anchored at Botany Bay. On the 26th of January 1788, the British raised their flag at Sydney Cove. The first encounters between Eora clans and the British were a study in contrasts. But cultural misunderstandings and growing pressures quickly strained relations. The British took land for crops, felled trees, and polluted the water. Yet amidst these tragedies, stories of human connection and resilience emerged. By the end of 1788, Sydney was no longer a remote bay, but a fledgling settlement, its future balanced on a knife's edge. As the first year closed, both peoples faced an uncertain future, one group looking for a new life, the other fighting to preserve an ancient way of living. In the early years after the flag was raised at Sydney Cove, life in the new settlement was harsh, fragile, and profoundly uncertain. This was not the vision of an empire instantly brought to life, but a desperate scramble for survival at the edge of the known world. The supplies brought from England were barely enough for the journey and quickly dwindled. Early attempts at European-style agriculture failed in the unfamiliar soil and climate. The colony hovered on the brink of starvation more than once. Rationing was severe, and scurvy haunted the camps. A rapid expansion of settlement, the spread of disease, and ongoing violence further displaced the Eora and neighboring clans. Some resisted, with guerrilla tactics raiding farms, sabotaging crops, fighting to hold their ancestral lands. Others sought new ways to coexist, navigating the shifting realities with resilience and adaptability. Yet the trauma of dispossession ran deep, reshaping family lines and cultural memory. It is a wound that is never fully healed. Free settlers began to arrive in greater numbers, seeking land and opportunity. Sydney's population swelled, and its boundaries crept further inland. Markets opened, the first newspapers appeared, and the outlines of a city vibrant, unruly. Ever-evolving emerged from the muddy shores of the harbour. The officers, led by Governor Arthur Phillip, learned quickly that survival demanded adaptability. The story of these years is not merely one of triumph or tragedy, but of a hard-fought beginning. Out of chains and chaos, Sydney began to forge its own identity, not a quite British, nor wholly Aboriginal, but something uniquely its own, brimming with both possibility and contradiction. The convict colony developed its own rough character, a culture of irreverence, dark humor, resourcefulness, and occasionally outright defiance of authority. Arthur Phillip I strove for fairness and discipline, often clashing with his officers to protect the vulnerable and encourage reform. His successors faced different challenges. Governor John Hunter rebuilt after a series of disasters, while Governor Philip Gidley King cracked down on corruption. It was Governor William Blythe, mutiny on the Bounty. Fame, who became embroiled in the Rum Rebellion of 1808. It's the only successful armed takeover of government in Australian history. The New South Wales Corps, tired of Blythe's reforms and efforts to control their power, arrested him and seized control of the colony. For a brief anarchic period, Sydney was ruled by its own military oligarchy. The notorious Irish convict uprising at Castle Hill in 1804, brutally suppressed, hinted at the tensions boiling beneath the surface. Rebellion was always a possibility, yet so was invention. Convicts constructed some of Australia's oldest surviving buildings, including the first government house and St. James Church. They scoured the bush for edible plants, traded with local Eora people for fish, and sent out hunting parties for kangaroo and birds. Despite every hardship, the colony held on its very persistence, a testament to human stubbornness. He set about turning Sydney from a ragged penal camp into a thriving town. Under his direction, roads were built, hospitals and schools established, public works commissioned, and a plan for a city grid mapped out. Macquarie's works, many designed by convict architect Francis Greenways, still dot the city today. From the graceful St. James Church to the Hyde Park Barracks, he encouraged emancipated convicts to become landowners and tradespeople, helping to seed a new class of settlers whose loyalty was to this new place rather than the distant British crown. The men and women who shaped the foundations of Sydney were convicts, many in chains, some little more than children and their keepers. A cadre of military officers whose own fates were chained to this alien, isolated outpost. For many, transportation was a cruel exile, but it also held the possibility of redemption. In the stifling heat, under brutal discipline and ceaseless work, some forged new lives. They quarried stone, felled trees, dug wells, and laid the earliest roads. In these back-breaking labors, Sydney's bones were set. The Tank Stream, which ran through today's city center, supplied water. Crude huts and government buildings sprang up along its banks. When the first fleet arrived, the immediate concern was food. The convicts sentenced for crimes ranging from theft to forgery brought with them their own microcosm of British society's class divides, its slangs, its strengths, and its vices. But the social structure of the colony was delicate. The officers, members of the New South Wales Corps, known colloquially as the Rum Corps, often clashed with the governors sent from London. These men, entrusted with military and civil authority, quickly became Sydney's first power brokers, controlling the colony's supply of rum and using it as currency in lieu of scarce coin. A shadow economy developed, with spirits traded for labor, goods, and even official favors. This rum economy would dominate the city's political and social life for decades. For the original custodians of the land, these years were devastating. Yet, amid the hardship, something distinctly new began to take root. Governors played an outsized role in shaping Sydney's early destiny. Order was restored by Governor Lachlan Macquarie, who arrived in 1810. Macquarie's vision was transformative. By the 1820s, the colony was growing rapidly. Yet for all its energy and promise, this was still a city built on hard ground, its wealth drawn from the sweat of the punished, its order kept by force. As the age of convicts gave way to the era of free settlers, foundations had been laid for a new kind of city, restless, resourceful, and forever on the move. By the 1820s, Sydney was evolving, no longer just a penal outpost, but the beating heart of a burgeoning colony. The world beyond the settlement's muddy streets beckoned with the promise of land, wealth, and freedom. As the age of convict transportation began to wane, a new era dawned, shaped by waves of free settlers, ambitious land grants, and a society seeking its own identity amid the wilds of New South Wales. The wild days of the Rum Corps gradually faded, replaced by a city government intent on imposing structure, sometimes literally. His support for emancipist former convicts who had served their time helped to create a unique social fabric. Agriculture and pastoralism took root beyond the town limits, with wool soon emerging as a major export. Sydney's port, naturally deep and protected, grew busier with each passing year. Connecting the colony to the broader British Empire and to markets across the world, warehouses, wharves, and markets bustled with the business of trade. Newspapers such as the Sydney Gazette, Australia's first, fostered a nascent public sphere. Schools, theaters, and libraries appeared, offering new opportunities for learning and recreation. The city's churches, Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, became not only houses of worship but pillars of community life, supporting charities, schools, and hospitals. Social clubs, sports, and music flourished, shaping a lively and often boisterous urban culture. The city's first banks and insurance companies opened their doors, laying the groundwork for Sydney's future as a financial capital. In Sydney, status was not determined solely by birth, but by achievement, enterprise, and, often, resilience in the face of adversity. The expansion of settlement pushed ever further into Aboriginal lands, leading to escalating conflict and dispossession. What began as a prison camp carved from the bush had become a colonial city, ambitious, imperfect, always reaching for something more. And on the horizon, a new force was gathering, the lure of gold, which would soon upend everything, and propel Sydney into a new era of wealth, migration, and transformation. The colonial government, keen to secure its claims, issued land grants that ignored existing Indigenous rights. In response, Aboriginal resistance flared in many areas, sometimes overt, often quiet but persistent. The early 19th century was a time of great loss for many Aboriginal communities, their lands and lifeways increasingly threatened by the colonial juggernaut. This spirit, half egalitarian, half fiercely competitive, would become one of the city's defining traits. Streets were laid out, often along the old footpaths and bullock tracks, and buildings took on a more permanent character. Stone quarries at Pyrmont and around the harbour supplied the blocks for new public buildings, churches, and grand homes. The city's skyline rose, not with skyscrapers, but with the elegant spires and arches of Georgian and Regency architecture. Below them were emancipists, carving out a place through perseverance and skill. Convicts still arrived through the 1830s, though in declining numbers, and their labor underpinned much of the city's growth. At the margins were the Aboriginal peoples, increasingly marginalized but never entirely erased, their survival an act of resistance in itself. The British government, eager to stabilize the colony and encourage economic self-sufficiency, began to encourage migration by offering generous parcels of land to free settlers. These men and women, some born of privilege, others simply determined to reinvent themselves, embarked on perilous journeys halfway around the globe. No longer was the city's fate tied solely to the administration of punishment. It was now a laboratory for British social experiment, a place where the ambitions of individuals could, with luck and guile, be realized. The population swelled. From just a few thousand at the turn of the century, Sydney's numbers climbed rapidly, fed by the arrival of farmers, artisans, merchants, and their families. Towns and villages began to appear on the city's fringes, the beginnings of what would become sprawling suburbs. They arrived to a city in flux, a chaotic sprawl of stone, timber, and tents. Clustered around the harbour and sprawling out along tracks that would one day become bustling streets, the influx of free settlers marked a profound shift in the character of Sydney. This new population brought with it a hunger for order and civility. Governor Lachlan Macquarie's vision continued to shape Sydney long after his tenure ended. The city's economic life, once reliant on government handouts and the labor of the incarcerated, began to diversify. Yet beneath this veneer of progress, tensions simmered. The stratification of colonial society became ever more pronounced. At the top were the free settlers, landowners, officials, entrepreneurs, who shaped Sydney's institutions and ambitions. As Sydney expanded, so too did its cultural life. By 1842, Sydney's population topped 30,000. That year, the town was formally incorporated as a city, and its first elected council took office. An important step toward local self-government and the democracy that would eventually take root. The people of Sydney, many with little loyalty to Britain except by law, began to see themselves as something new: Australians. The city's identity, once defined by its penal origins, was now being recast by its diversity, dynamism, and restless drive to expand. But it was not all progress and promise. Fires, floods, and disease regularly swept the growing city, exposing the fragility of its infrastructure and the vulnerability of its poorest citizens. Slums developed alongside grand estates. The contrasts of wealth and want, opportunity and exclusion, became ever more stark. Still, by the middle of the 19th century, Sydney had unmistakably changed. In 1851, the first glimmer of gold was spotted glinting in the streams west of Sydney, and everything changed. What had been a slow-burning colonial experiment ignited overnight into a feverish pursuit of fortune, hope, and reinvention. Thousands first from across the Australian colonies, then from Britain, Europe, China, and the Americas descended upon New South Wales. Sydney's port, once the gateway for convicts and settlers, now bustled with eager prospectors, fortune seekers, and merchants. Tents and shanty towns mushroomed along the harbour, and into the city's fringe. As gold fever gripped the populace and the city swelled with anticipation, squalid slums sprang up in the rocks in Darlinghurst. Disease, crime, and overcrowding became chronic issues. Chinese miners, in particular, faced discrimination and violence both on the fields and in the city. Anti-Chinese riots and restrictive legislation reflected a growing anxiety about difference, laying the seeds for the White Australia policies that would come to define the nation's future immigration stance. The contrasts between wealth and poverty sharpened. While the affluent built stately homes in Potts Point or Woollahra, many more lived in cramped tenements, eking out a living in factories, docks, or on the street. Sydney's press blossomed, with papers like the Sydney Morning Herald documenting every twist of the boom. The University of Sydney, Australia's first, opened in 1852. Symbolizing both the colony's confidence, its skyline dotted with spires and domes, its harbors crowded with ships, its streets alive with the pulse of commerce, ambition, and aspiration. No longer just the endpoint of convict ships, Sydney had become a place where fortunes were made and lost, where new Australians from every corner of the world forged a society at once turbulent, hopeful, and alive with possibility. The Eureka Rebellion in Victoria sent shockwaves across the colonies, prompting reflection in Sydney about the balance of power between ordinary people and authority. But on the horizon, new forces industry, federation, global war would soon shape Sydney's destiny in ways no one could yet imagine. Calls for democratic reform gained momentum. The city's citizens pushed for greater representation and responsible government, eventually securing the right to elect their own parliament. An essential step on the path toward federation and Australian nationhood. In its aspiration to join the ranks of the world's great cities, the city's first railway line, from Sydney to Parramatta, opened in 1855, shrinking distances and linking the metropolis ever more tightly with its hinterland. Theaters, music halls, and cricket grounds filled with people hungry for entertainment and diversion. Sporting clubs, literary societies, and trade unions all took root, building a civil society that would become Sydney's backbone. The discovery of gold at Ophir near Bathurst triggered a rush that would transform Sydney from a provincial outpost into a dynamic metropolis pulsing with new life. The city became the beating heart of a new economy, supplying diggers with tools, clothing, and provisions, and serving as the point of export for the precious metal that would bankroll an empire. Banks, shipping firms, and insurance companies flourished. The expansion of the city and its hinterlands further dispossessed communities already decimated by disease and conflict. Yet their resilience persisted. Families and communities adapted, finding new ways to survive in a city that too often sought to erase their presence. New roads and railways radiated from Sydney into the interior, transforming the region's infrastructure and accelerating the pace of urbanization. Within weeks, the news of gold spread like wildfire. For Sydney, the gold rush meant more than the mere movement of people. It signaled a profound social and economic revolution. The city's population boomed. From around 39,000 residents in 1851, Sydney surged toward 200,000 by the century's end. Streets once muddy and meandering were paved and expanded. Grand Victorian buildings, many of which still grace the city today, rose along George and Pitt Street's banks, hotels, arcades, and theaters, testaments to newfound wealth and civic ambition. Hyde Park and the Domain, once on the city's edges, were formalized as grand public spaces. And the city's botanical gardens bloomed into verdant symbols of progress and taste. But with prosperity came profound challenges. The sudden influx of migrants, many of them young, single, and poor, strained the city's housing and resources. Social tensions simmered as well. The goldfields themselves were scenes of intense cultural exchange and at times bitter conflict. Not yet. The gold rush also unleashed waves of energy and optimism. Civic leaders and philanthropists, many made wealthy by gold or commerce, invested in public works. Hospitals, schools, and charities expanded their reach. Yet the era was not without unrest. Amidst all this change, Sydney's Aboriginal peoples faced renewed hardship. By the end of the 1870s, Sydney was a city transformed. The city's story was now inseparable from the currents of gold and migration. As the echoes of the gold rush faded, Sydney entered a new phase of restless ambition, a period defined not by the rush for riches, but by the steady pulse of industry and invention. The closing decades of the 19th century and the dawn of the 20th witnessed the city's transformation from a colonial capital into a thriving industrial powerhouse. One poised on the edge of nationhood and modernity. By the 1880s, Sydney's harbour side was a forest of masts and cranes. Breweries, tanneries, brickworks, and abattoirs provided employment to thousands. The city's population surged once more, climbing toward 500,000 by the outbreak of the First World War. Terraced houses filled the inner suburbs, built from the local sandstone that gave Sydney its golden glow at sunset. They championed public health, education, and the improvement of working conditions. Trade unions gained strength, fighting for better wages and safety in the city's factories and workshops. The 8-hour workday, an ideal imported from Britain, was won through fierce struggle, earning Sydney a reputation as a city of both opportunity and agitation. Steamships now plied the waters where once only bark canoes and sailboats ventured. Sporting clubs, especially for cricket, rugby, and the newly invented rugby league, drew crowds in the thousands. The University of Sydney and the city's burgeoning schools and libraries produced a new generation of scientists, artists, and leaders. It was a city of contradictions, rich and poor, old and new, colonial and modern, but united by a sense of destiny. The industrial powerhouse by the harbour was no longer merely a British outpost. It was a world city, crucible of change and invention, poised to face the 20th century with all its promise and peril. The suffrage movement, led by women like Louisa Lawson and Maybank Anderson, gained ground by 1902. South Wales women had the right to vote in federal elections, a triumph that rippled across the nation. Opulent mansions overlooked slums where the city's poorest scraped by in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The Rocks, in particular, became notorious for its crime, poverty, and disease. Even as developers and reformers schemed to remake it, fires, floods, and economic downturns especially. The Depression of the 1890s tested Sydney's resilience, but the city always seemed to bounce back, driven by its restless, entrepreneurial spirit. The Royal Easter Show, first held in 1823 and still a beloved institution, grew into a spectacle of agriculture, entertainment, and national pride. Sydney's beaches from Bondi to Manly began to lure city dwellers in search of sun and surf, laying the groundwork for the city's future as a mecca of beach culture. By the turn of the century, the Sydney tramway system was one of the largest in the world, a web of rails whisking commuters from Circular Quay to Randwick. The old tank stream, long overwhelmed, was covered over, replaced by reservoirs and more sophisticated systems. Yet their communities persisted, adapting to life in an ever-changing metropolis and maintaining cultural ties that would one day become central to Sydney's identity. Sydney played a crucial role in the federation debates of the 1890s. The city hosted key conventions, rallies, and public votes. Its citizens, while fiercely proud of their local identity, embraced the vision of an Australian Commonwealth. In 1901, when the colonies joined to form the nation of Australia, Sydney was one of its crown jewels, larger and more cosmopolitan than ever before. The city's first sewer lines were laid, though outbreaks of typhoid and cholera persisted into the 20th century, a grim reminder that progress was always uneven, often bought at the expense of the poor. From the city centre out to burgeoning suburbs like Newtown and Bondi, modernity had arrived. Sydney's daily rhythms now pulsed to the clang of bells and the hum of machinery. Wool, wheat, coal, and gold commodities that had built the colony's fortunes now filled the holds of ships bound for London, Shanghai, San Francisco, and beyond.
Ow.
The docks at Darling Harbour and Walsh Bay buzzed with the commerce of empire, while the city's railways, now fanning out from Central Station, linked the metropolis to distant hinterlands and country towns. Industry flourished. Foundries and factories rose in Pyrmont, Ultimo, and Alexandria, their chimneys billowing smoke across the skyline. With industrial growth came remarkable innovation. The city electrified its trams and lit its streets with gas, and soon after, electric lamps. But industrial progress brought new challenges. Sydney's infrastructure groaned under the weight of its own success. Water supply and sanitation became pressing issues. Urban reformers and social activists emerged to tackle these challenges head-on. Culture and leisure blossomed alongside industry. Theaters, music halls, and cinemas offered respite from the rigors of urban life. Yet, as always, the city was marked by contrasts. The city's Aboriginal people, still enduring the legacy of dispossession and discrimination, found themselves increasingly pushed to the margins. Amidst this ferment, a new idea began to gather force. The notion that the disparate colonies of Australia should unite as a single nation. The early 20th century brought new milestones. The city's first skyscraper, the Colwilla Chambers, rose above Pitt Street. As the world inched toward war in 1914, Sydney stood transformed. As the guns of August 1914 thundered across Europe, their echoes reached the distant shores of Sydney. The First World War would draw the city into the gravest conflict it had ever known, reshaping not only its streets and institutions but the very character of its people. Over 60,000 Australians would lose their lives in the war, and Sydney, then Australia's largest and most cosmopolitan city, would bear a heavy share of the nation's sacrifice. From Circular Quay to the working-class terraces of Redfern, enlistment rallies filled the air with speeches and song. Young men, eager for adventure or swayed by duty and patriotism, signed up by the thousands. New movements for gender equality, fueled by necessity and the suffrage victories of earlier decades, found fresh momentum. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1919, arriving on returning troop ships, swept through Sydney with deadly speed, killing thousands and testing the city's fragile public health systems. Their departure was marked by public farewells and tearful crowds at the city's railway stations. Yet as the war dragged on and casualty lists grew longer, Sydney's initial enthusiasm gave way to grief and anxiety. Unemployment soared by 1932. 1 in 3 Sydneysiders was out of work. Shantytowns sprang up along the banks of the Parramatta River and in the parks of the inner city. The contrast between the city's glittering skyline and the suffering of its poorest residents could not have been starker. Protest marches and hunger riots shook city streets and the Battle of the Bridge, a violent confrontation between police and the unemployed on the day. The Sydney Harbour Bridge opened became a symbol of a city on the brink. The city's hospitals swelled with the wounded. Charities mobilized to care for returned soldiers and their families. The war years brought profound social changes. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, staffing offices, factories, and transport systems vacated by men at the front. As the 1920s dawned, Sydney yearned for renewal. The decade that followed, often called the Roaring Twenties, brought an air of optimism, reflected in Art Deco buildings, jazz clubs, and the first glimmers of modern pop culture. Motorcars jostled with trams on the city's growing network of roads. Cinema palaces like the State Theatre and the Capitol glittered with moviegoers. And Bondi Beach, with its iconic surf life-saving clubs, became a symbol of leisure and modern Australian identity. But beneath the glitter, storm clouds gathered. The Great Depression struck in 1929, and Sydney was hit with merciless force. As the guns fell silent in 1945, Sydney found itself standing at the crossroads of history, battered by conflict but brimming with hope and ambition. The Second World War had not only changed the world, it had also transformed Sydney's very fabric. The devastation of Europe had unleashed a wave of migration, and Australia hungry for labor or growth. And security flung open its doors. Suburbs once homogenous began to buzz with new languages, cuisines, and customs. Maroubra echoed with the sounds of Greek festivals. Leichhardt became Little Italy. And the factories and wharves filled with hardworking newcomers eager to build new lives. The post-war boom in population and prosperity spurred a frenzy of building. The annual Royal Easter Show, Anzac Day marches, and the Sydney to Hobart yacht race remained beloved rituals. Conceived in the 1950s and brought to life through the vision of Danish architect Jørn Utzon, the Opera House was more than a building. It was a statement of intent. Soaring sails, rising from Bennelong Point, announced to the world that Sydney had arrived. Its streets thrummed with the rhythms of the world. Mediterranean markets, Asian groceries, Irish pubs, and Chinese temples sat alongside Anglican churches and stately Victorian terraces. The Australian dream of a suburban home and the reality of highries. Flats and migrant hostels coexisted in uneasy harmony. The city was not without its tensions, but it had learned more than any other in Australia how to absorb and celebrate difference. Construction was fraught with controversy, delays, and ballooning costs. But when the Opera House finally opened in 1973, it instantly became a global icon. It was a city of surf and skyscrapers, footy and fine art, tradition and transformation. Its future would be written by the millions who called it home, drawn from every corner of the globe and bound together by the endless promise of the Harbour. Forever changing the way the city was seen and the way it saw itself, the surf lifesavers at Bondi and Coogee continued their watch, embodying a sunburnt, egalitarian ideal. Sport, music, and the arts flourished. Sydney's orchestras, theatre companies, and galleries blossomed, drawing audiences hungry for both the new and the familiar. The skyline sprouted new towers and modernist blocks. The city's first skyscrapers, like the Ant Building and Australia's Square Rose, above the old sandstone and Victorian spires. Symbols of a city eager to claim its place in the modern world. Aboriginal Australians, long marginalized, began to demand recognition and justice. The 1965 Freedom Ride, inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement, shone a harsh light on discrimination in country towns and Sydney itself. Activism, art, and resilience converged as the city's first peoples reclaimed their place in the story of the city. Roads and freeways sliced through old neighborhoods, while new suburbs sprawled west and south along the railway lines and highways. Shopping centers, drive-ins, and motels reflected the changing tastes and habits of a population increasingly mobile and car-dependent. Markets, cafes, and churches multiplied, while the city's sporting clubs, music halls, and social scenes welcomed fresh energy and global flair. Sydney became the nation's front porch. Ships and planes brought hundreds of thousands, British 10-pound palms, Southern and Eastern Europeans fleeing war and persecution, Greeks, Italians, Maltese, Dutch, Poles, Hungarians, and later, people from Turkey, Lebanon, and Asia. By 1971, 1 in 3 Sydney-siders had been born overseas. The city, which once looked almost exclusively to Britain, was now turning outward, eager to embrace new ideas, faces, and futures. The decades that followed would be a time of bold reinvention, of population booms, radical architecture, and the first stirrings of the city's modern multicultural identity. The most profound change came in the shape of people. These new arrivals changed the city in ways both subtle and profound. This migration boom brought challenges too. Housing shortages and sprawling, hastily built suburbs tested the city's infrastructure. Nissan huts and fibro cottages dotted the city's fringe, home to families who often arrived with little more than a suitcase and hope. The transition was sometimes jarring. Old prejudices lingered, and discrimination could make life difficult. Yet over time, the newcomers made their mark, helping to reshape Sydney into a city known for its openness and resilience. Meanwhile, the city's physical landscape was being reimagined. Yet, even as the city embraced modernity, it clung to its traditions. Perhaps the most visible symbol of this era was the birth of the Sydney Opera House. The period also brought the first stirrings of social and political change. By the close of the 1960s, Sydney was a city transformed. Sydney now stood at the threshold of the modern age, larger, richer, and more complex than ever before. By the 1970s, Sydney was a city in restless motion. The dust had barely settled from the post-war building boom, yet a new force was surging through its streets and suburbs, a drive for recognition, rights, and real equality. Yet beneath its white sails, Sydney's people were challenging the status quo like never before. The city became a crucible for activism, its pavements echoing with marches, protests, and calls for justice. Women's liberation, Indigenous rights, gay rights, environmentalism, and multiculturalism all found powerful voice and momentum here. The years that followed would see Sydney shake off old certainties, embrace bold activism, and emerge as the vanguard of Australia's social and cultural transformation. The Save Our Sirius campaign protected public housing and iconic modernist architecture. While the Green Bands movement, led by the Builders Laborers Federation, stopped developers from bulldozing historic neighborhoods, parklands, and even rainforests. And the arrival of refugees from Vietnam, Lebanon, Chile, and beyond made Sydney an even more cosmopolitan metropolis. New languages, foods, religions, and customs blended into the city's fabric. From the Lunar New Year festivals in Cabramatta to the Orthodox Easter processions in Marrickville, Sydney was no longer just British outpost. It was a city of the world. Sydney became a model for urban conservation, where the voices of residents, unions, activists shaped the very streets and skylines of the future. Here, Redfern became the beating heart of the urban Aboriginal movement. The area home to one of Australia's largest Indigenous communities, birthed organizations that would change the nation. Aboriginal legal and health services, art collectives, and land rights campaigns. The stock market crash of 1987 jolted the city's financial sector. But Sydney's place as Australia's commercial engine was never seriously threatened. Economic recessions, rising house prices, and social dislocation tested families and communities. Poverty and homelessness became more visible, especially in inner-city neighborhoods. Crime, drug epidemics, and the AIDS crisis cast long shadows. But as always, Sydney's resilience and sense of possibility fueled efforts to rebuild, care, and create anew. Computers and telecommunications began to reshape office life and connect Sydneysiders in ways unimaginable a decade earlier. It was a city of protest and pride, where activism didn't just challenge power, it rewrote the story. A city of dazzling festivals, thriving arts, and fierce debates. Sydney's spirit had shifted from colonial certainty to the wild, hopeful openness of a truly global city. New industries took root in science, education, and technology, laying the foundations for a knowledge economy. Sydney's first Mardi Gras parade, held in 1978 as a protest for gay and lesbian rights, was met by police violence and mass arrests. But it ignited a movement that could not be silenced. Today, the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras is one of the world's great celebrations of diversity, drawing hundreds of thousands of revelers and sending a message of pride and inclusion from Oxford Street to the world. Protests and celebrations alike spilled from Redfern Park, and the annual Survival Day events on January 26 countered the national narrative of Australia Day, insisting that the city's first story was and remains Aboriginal. The Opera House, newly opened and dazzling on the harbour, stood as a symbol of ambition and modernity. In 1972, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy was established on the lawns of Parliament House in Canberra, but its influence was deeply felt in Sydney. Women's voices grew louder too. The 1970s saw the birth of women's refuges, rape crisis centres, and campaigns for equal pay and reproductive rights. Sydney hosted Australia's first International Women's Day March in 1972. Activists, writers, and politicians from all backgrounds reshaped the city's public life. The feminist movement transformed not just laws, but attitudes in homes, workplaces, and schools across the suburbs. Just as transformative was the fight for LGBTIQ+ rights, the city's environment also became a battleground. As suburbs sprawled and industry boomed, pollution, destruction of bushland, and threats to the harbour triggered a green awakening. Migration continued to shape the city. The official end of the White Australia policy in the 1970s, these years were also marked by economic and technological change. Yet for all its dynamism, the city was not without hardship. By 1990, Sydney had become an undeniable symbol of diversity and energy. On the horizon, new challenges and opportunities awaited a new millennium, new technologies, and new voices ready to shape the next chapter of this extraordinary urban wonder. As the 20th century drew to a close, Sydney stood on the threshold of a new era. No longer just Australia's biggest city, it had become a global player, a vibrant, multicultural metropolis, famous not only for its natural beauty, but for its cultural confidence and creative energy. From the inner city to the farthest suburbs, new communities blossomed. Traffic congestion and public transport woes tested commuters. Environmental concerns, from water shortages to air pollution, winning the bid was a national triumph. It's a chance to showcase the city's dynamism to billions across the world. In the years leading up to the Games, Sydney underwent a dramatic transformation. The city's confidence soared, fueling a boom in the arts, design, and technology. The September 11th attacks in the United States, followed by the Bali bombings, cast a pall over the city's sense of security. Racial tensions occasionally flared, as in the Cronulla riots of 2005, starkly exposing the work still needed to build harmony in a city of so many backgrounds. Indigenous land rights, environmental activism, and LGBTQ advocacy all made headway. The sorry speech by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in 2008, delivered just a few kilometers from the site of the First Fleet landing, acknowledged the suffering of the stolen generations, a moment of reflection for the entire nation, and especially for Sydney's Aboriginal communities. And globally connected, yet still shaped by its past and by the natural wonders of its harbour, headlands, and beaches. It was a city of stories, of Indigenous custodians, convicts, migrants, activists, artists, athletes, and entrepreneurs. A city as ever in the midst of transformation. Writing the next chapter in its extraordinary journey from Aboriginal roots to urban wonder, the housing bubble, global financial crisis, and debates about sustainable growth tested policymakers and families alike. Water restrictions and bushfires brought climate change to the forefront of public debate. The city invested in recycling renewable energy and greening projects. The coastline was better protected, native vegetation restored, and the harbour cleaner than it had been in generations. Darling Harbour, Barangaroo, and the city's foreshore were revitalized. It became a magnet for the world's best and brightest. Students from China and India filled the lecture halls of its universities. Entrepreneurs flocked to tech hubs in Surrey Hills and Permont. World-class chefs and designers made the city an epicenter for creativity. Sydney's festivals, Vivid Sydney, the Biennale, New Year's Eve fireworks, and the ever-expanding Mardi Gras drew international crowds and put the city's unique mix of nature and urban life on display. New icons joined the Opera House and Harbour Bridge, from the Olympic Park precinct to the Luminous Museum of Contemporary Art. Old industrial sites at Homebush Bay were remade into Olympic Park, an ambitious project that combined state-of-the-art sporting facilities with wetlands restoration and green design, setting new standards for environmental sustainability. And the health of the harbour forced Sydney to grapple with the impact of its own success. In Chatswood and Hurstville, Mandarin and Cantonese became as common as English. Lebanese bakeries thrived in Bankstown, Turkish markets in Auburn, and African shops in Blacktown. Sydney's schools, restaurants, and places of worship reflected every corner of the globe, making it one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities. In these decades, the city would embrace the world, weather news storms, and leave an indelible mark on history. The 1990s brought both challenge and triumph. Sydney's population soared, fueled by immigration and a booming economy. Yet with growth came pressure. The city's housing market became fiercely competitive, driving up prices and making home ownership a struggle for many. The world watched as Kathy Freeman, an Indigenous athlete, lit the Olympic flame, and days later, ran to gold in the 400-meter Zan image that became a symbol of reconciliation and national pride. The city's volunteers, nicknamed the Smiling Face of Sydney, won hearts everywhere. The Opera House and Harbour Bridge formed a breathtaking backdrop for opening and closing ceremonies that celebrated both Australia's ancient roots and its modern multicultural identity. It was during this period, amid both optimism and anxiety, that Sydney prepared to host its greatest party, the 2000 Olympic Games. The Games themselves were a triumph. For 16 days in September 2000, Sydney dazzled. The Olympic legacy rippled far beyond sport. Sydney's transport, tourism, and infrastructure all received long-term boosts. The early years of the 21st century, however, were not without turbulence. Yet amid these challenges, Sydney continued to innovate. Social progress marched forward, if not always in a straight line. At the same time, Sydney's relationship with its environment entered a new phase. By 2010, Sydney was unmistakably a city of the new millennium, brash, diverse. As the 2010s unfolded, Sydney surged into the future with the momentum of a true world city. The skyline already punctuated by icons. reached ever higher new glass towers rising alongside the historic sandstone of the city's colonial core. Cranes dotted the horizon from Barangaroo to Parramatta, each one a symbol of Sydney's relentless drive for growth. Yet beneath the city's gleaming surface, tension between prosperity and hardship, innovation and tradition, became ever more pronounced. Sydney's population crested 5 million, a vibrant tapestry of ancestry and aspiration. Almost 40% of its residents were born overseas, hailing from every continent, making the city a living mosaic of languages, cultures, and faiths. The fight for marriage equality, won nationally in 2017, brought crowds into the city in celebration, a testament to Sydney's long role as a beacon for LGBTIQ+ rights in the Southern Hemisphere. Vivid Sydney transformed the winter skyline into a kaleidoscope of color. The Biennale and Sydney Festival drew artists and audiences from across the globe. Sports, from the NRL Grand Final to the Sydney to Hobart yacht race, continued to inspire it, remained a city of extraordinary beauty and opportunity, challenged by inequality and environmental risk, but ever forward-looking, creative, and resilient. Its greatest resource was, and remains, the energy and dreams of all who have called its shores home, from the first Australians to the newest arrivals, and unite the city, even as changing demographics brought new games and traditions into the mainstream. Indigenous leadership and culture were increasingly celebrated, with events like NAIDOC Week, the Yabin Festival, and the revival of language and cultural practices across the region. As cases spread in early 2020, Sydney, like cities around the world, shut down. Streets emptied, businesses shuttered, and lives were put on hold. For many, the city's much-vaunted lifestyle-its, cafes, beaches, theaters, and festivals vanished overnight. Yet, amid isolation, stories of resilience emerged. Health workers, teachers, volunteers, and neighbors stepped up. Sydneysiders applauded from balconies, delivered groceries to the vulnerable, and adapted to remote work and learning. Technology and community spirit proved as important as infrastructure in weathering the storm, yet the work of reconciliation, closing the gap in health, education, and opportunity remained urgent. Korean barbecue sizzled in Strathfield, Ethiopian coffee steamed in Marrickville, and Ramadan markets drew thousands to Lakemba. Schools across Sydney rang with dozens of languages, while art, music, cuisine from around the globe filled the city's festivals and streets. With growth, however, came acute challenges. Housing affordability reached crisis point. In the face of disaster, whether fire, drought, or disease, the city's people once again found ways to innovate, care, and rebuild. The dream of a backyard home gave way for many to the realities of apartment living and relentless bidding wars. High prices pushed young families and newcomers further west and south, spurring a boom in high-rise construction and a transformation of the city's once sleepy outer suburbs. Congestion became a daily frustration. Despite investments in new motorways, light rail, and expanded public transport, Sydney's roads and trains were crowded as never before. The city's famed beauty, its clean beaches, sparkling harbour, and green parks remained a point of pride. But environmental pressures mounted. Climate change brought record heat waves, devastating bushfires, and extreme weather events. The Black Summer of 2019 to 2020 saw smoke haze blanket the city, wildlife decimated, and Sydneysiders volunteering, donating, and rallying to aid those affected across New South Wales. Through it all, Sydney's spirit of innovation never dimmed. The city became a leading tech and creative hub for the Asia-Pacific. Startups, fintech, media, and biomedical research flourished in places like Surrey Hills, Macquarie Park, and the ever-expanding university precincts. World-class education and research continued to draw students from China, India, Southeast Asia, and beyond, shaping not just campuses but entire neighborhoods. Socially, the city was at a crossroads. Major debates over transport, urban density, Indigenous recognition, and refugees played out on Sydney's streets and in its parliaments. The city's cultural energy was as electric as ever. But the decade's final months brought an unexpected test. The COVID-19 pandemic. The first months of the pandemic reminded Sydney of its essential strengths: adaptability, diversity, and an unyielding sense of community. By the dawn of the 2020s, Sydney was both changed and enduring. The city's next chapter was about to begin, shaped, as always, by the imagination and determination of millions. The story of Sydney in the 2020s is still being written. Unfolding in real time beneath the changing light of the Harbour, the city stands at a crossroads tested by crisis, but more conscious than ever of its own strengths, its deep histories, and the challenges yet to come. Lockdowns brought silence to the busiest streets and emptied the beaches that once symbolized the city's open, easy spirit. Landmarks like the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge, usually bustling with tourists and locals alike, stood quiet, awaiting the city's return. Schools and workplaces moved online, revealing both the possibilities of a digital future and the painful divides of unequal access. For months at a time, Sydney was forced to look inward, deflecting on what mattered most: community, connection, health, and hope. From Lunar New Year in Haymarket to Ramadan in Lake Mba, Diwali in Harris Park, and NAIDOC Week celebrations across the Harbour, Sydney's calendar is a tapestry of festivals and traditions. Inequality, both visible and invisible, persists, reflected in health, education, and employment gaps across the city's postcodes. The city's people, drawn from every land and background, continue to adapt, create, and connect. It will be shaped by new waves of migration, new technologies, and new dreams. It will remember its deep Aboriginal roots and honor the many stories woven through its streets and suburbs. Above all, Sydney will continue to surprise, to challenge, and to welcome, holding fast to its identity as a city of resilience, renewal, and boundless possibility. Whether facing fire, flood, pandemic, or the day-to-day challenges of urban life, Sydney-siders have shown again and again a capacity to come together, to innovate, and to find joy even in the hardest times. As the city grows, so do debates about density, transport, and the balance between preservation and progress. Rising sea levels and climate change threaten coastal communities and the city's iconic landscapes. The ongoing work of reconciliation, injustice, supporting self-determination, and closing the gap remains urgent. Local food scenes, music, and art pulse with energy drawn from every part of the globe. The city's Aboriginal heritage, too, is increasingly honored, not just in ceremonies or landmarks, but through truth-telling language revival and genuine partnerships with First Nations communities. A new era of listening, learning, and reconciliation is slowly taking shape. As Sydney begins to more fully reckon with its past and imagine a more just future, the COVID-19 pandemic cast a long shadow over Sydney's daily life. Startups, creative industries, and global companies cluster in new business districts from Barangaroo to Macquarie Park. Universities, hospitals, and research centers collaborate to drive advances in medicine, clean energy, and digital technology. The smart city movement is turning Sydney into a laboratory for new approaches to sustainability, transport, and urban life. The city's creative scene, always inventive, adapted quickly with virtual performances, pop-up exhibitions, and new ways of bringing people together, both online and off. Essential workers, nurses, cleaners, supermarket staff were newly recognized for their central role in keeping the city functioning. Debates about affordable housing, safe workplaces, and the mental health toll of lockdowns became more urgent and visible. As remote and hybrid work patterns persisted, the geography of Sydney shifted again, with more people moving to the outer suburbs and regional areas, seeking space, affordability, and new ways of life. Sporting matches played to reduced or remote audiences became new rituals of resilience. But as restrictions eased, the city came roaring back. Theaters and galleries reopened their doors. Festivals returned, sometimes tentatively, sometimes with defiant exuberance. The public health emergency also sparked wider conversations about inequality, housing, and the future of work. The environment, too, remained at the center of Sydney's story. Bushfires, floods, and severe weather events kept climate resilience at the top of the city's agenda. Major projects in renewable energy, green building, and public transport took shape. Urban planners, scientists, and community activists worked to green the city, planting trees, restoring wetlands, and designing cooler, more livable neighborhoods. Sydney's leadership in climate adaptation began to draw international attention as other cities looked to its successes and setbacks for inspiration. The city's cultural and demographic diversity, once seen as a challenge, is now widely recognized as its greatest strength. Technological innovation continues to reshape the city. Sydney is now a Pacific Rim tech and finance hub, attracting talent from across Australia and beyond. But Sydney's challenges remain real. Housing affordability is still a major concern, with many priced out of the neighborhoods where they grew up. And yet through it all, Sydney's resilience endures. The future of Sydney is unwritten, as open and dynamic as the surf breaking on Bondi or the lights shimmering on the harbour at dusk. Sydney's story is a tapestry woven across tens of thousands of years, a place where ancient knowledge, survival, ambition, and reinvention intertwine. Its origins are found not in the arrival of British ships, but in the millennial custodianship of the Awara Nation and neighboring Aboriginal peoples. Convicts and colonists carved a precarious outpost from the bush, facing hardship and hunger, but also laying the city's earliest foundations through labor and resilience. The waves of free settlers and the fever of the gold rush propelled Sydney from penal colony to booming city, its skyline rising as fortunes were made and lost in its streets, filled with people from every corner of the globe. They shaped the landscape with care and deep wisdom, their traditions and stories still echoing in the city's rock engravings, waterways, and living cultures. Its journey is unfinished, its future an open invitation to all who would call this place home. With the landing of the First Fleet in 1788, Sydney's landscape was forever altered. Industry, invention, and social reform defined the city's emergence into the 20th century. As Sydney faced war, depression, and transformation, landmarks like the Harbour Bridge and Opera House became symbols not just of architectural prowess, but of hope, ambition, and unity. By the dawn of the new millennium, Sydney was hosting the world, its Olympic Games, a triumph of unity and reconciliation. The city became a global magnet, its neighborhoods vibrant with languages, cultures, and cuisines from around the world. The city's population swelled through post-war migration, forging a cosmopolitan identity marked by diversity, creativity, and adaptation. Yet, through it all, Sydney's spirit of resilience, innovation, and community has never faded. From its deep Aboriginal roots to its present as a hub of creativity, technology, and multicultural life, Sydney remains a city in perpetual motion, welcoming, evolving, and dreaming always of what lies just beyond the horizon. The late 20th century saw Sydney become a crucible of activism and social change, home to movements for Indigenous rights, women's liberation, LGBTIQ pride, and environmental justice. The 21st century has brought new challenges: housing pressures, environmental threats, and the disruptions of pandemic and climate. This is Sydney's history, one of endurance, transformation, and boundless possibility.